A 7-year-old girl walked into a Korean Mafia Boss's restaurant in the middle of a rainstorm and whispered 4 words that changed both their lives forever. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he'd done. She only knew he looked strong enough to stop what was coming through that door. Outside, 3 armed men were already stepping out of a black SUV. Inside, Kang Min-jae, the most feared crime boss in Los Angeles, had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether a child lived or died. He chose. And nothing was ever the same again. If you're watching this, comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain came down mean that night, not the soft, forgiving kind that washes things clean, the kind that punishes. It hammered the pavement on Western Avenue in sheets so thick the neon signs bled color across the asphalt like open wounds. Red, blue, gold. The Koreatown streets at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday in November looked like the inside of a dream nobody wanted to be having. Delivery scooters cutting through standing water, a drunk man arguing with a parking meter 2 blocks down, a woman in a yellow convenience store uniform pulling a plastic bag over her head and running for her car. Kang Min-jae noticed all of it through the window. He noticed everything. That was the habit of a man who had survived 41 years in circumstances that killed people with far better instincts than his. He sat alone in the 3rd booth from the back at Haenyo, a restaurant on the ground floor of a building he owned through 4 layers of shell companies. The place was small, 14 tables, soft overhead light the color of warm paper, the smell of doenjangji gai, and grilled mackerel and the pine-based floor cleaner the owner, Mrs. O, used every night before close. Min-jae had been coming here for 11 years. He came when he needed to think without anyone waiting for an answer from him. He came when the syndicate business got loud inside his skull and he needed a room that expected nothing. Tonight, he had a cup of barley tea going cold in front of him and a problem he had not yet found the language for. 3 weeks ago, a shipment had gone wrong at the port of Long Beach. Not gone wrong in the ordinary sense. Cargo misrouted, paperwork delayed, a bribe that didn't hold. Gone wrong in the sense that 2 of his men had turned up dead in a container yard with federal evidence markers already on the scene before his people even knew there was a body to collect. Someone with a federal badge had moved faster than the Baeko syndicate. That had never happened before. Not once in 11 years. Min-jae turned the barley teacup in his hands. His fingers were thick, the knuckles of his right hand slightly misaligned from a break that had healed badly when he was 22 and nobody had bothered to set the bone properly. He had 2 rings on his left hand, one a plain titanium band, one with the Baeko white tiger carved into onyx. The left hand was the hand he thought with. The right was the hand he worked with. He kept them separate in his mind. It helped. The restaurant was down to its last 2 tables of customers. A couple in the far corner splitting a bottle of maggioli, talking in low voices, probably married but not to each other. An older Korean man at the counter eating alone and reading something on his phone with reading glasses pushed down his nose. Mrs. O moved behind the kitchen pass-through, the sounds of final cleanup beginning, the flat clatter of metal bowls being stacked, the hiss of the industrial sprayer. Min-jae was thinking about the federal marker, about the specific code sequence on the evidence tag, which his people had photographed before anyone arrived. He'd had a former FBI contractor run the code quietly. What came back was a task force designation he didn't recognize. Not one of the standard agencies that worked the port. Not DEA, not HSI. A designation that technically didn't exist in the public record. That was the problem he didn't have language for yet. The shape of something he couldn't see clearly enough to name. The restaurant door opened. He didn't look up immediately. He registered it. The wet rush of cold air, the brief increase in rain sound, and kept his eyes on the table. His peripheral vision would tell him what he needed. It usually did. What it told him was small, very small, not adult small, child small. He looked up. She was maybe 6, maybe 7. Hard to tell under the oversized red rain slicker that hung past her knees and dripped steadily onto Mrs. O's clean floor. The hood had fallen back. Her hair was in braids, tight, neat braids that someone had done carefully, some of them decorated with small beads. And the rain had soaked through so that water ran in thin lines down her temples and the back of her neck. She was dark-skinned, black, with wide-set eyes that were doing the work of taking in an entire room at once, with the particular rapid focus of a child who has been trained to assess exits. Not by instinct, by instruction. That was the first thing that stopped him. The way she looked at the room. That wasn't a lost child's panic. That was a taught behavior. She was alone. He looked past her through the front window. Western Avenue. Rain. A black SUV idling at the curb on the far side of the street, headlights on, engine running. Visible through the rain-smeared glass as a soft blur of yellow-white light. Could be nothing. Could be a rideshare waiting. Could be exactly what his gut was already telling him it was. Which was not that. The girl had spotted him. He didn't know why she fixed on him specifically. Maybe it was the booth position, back wall, clear sight lines to both the door and the kitchen exit. Maybe it was that he was the only person in the room sitting alone and still. Maybe it was something she'd been told to look for and he happened to fit the description. He'd never know exactly. She walked toward him, not ran. Walked. 7 years old, soaking wet, alone in a restaurant at 11 at night in the rain, and she walked toward him with her chin slightly up and her jaw slightly set, which was the face of someone trying very hard not to show how scared they were. Min-jae had worn that face himself for the better part of a decade when he was coming up in the syndicate. He recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. She stopped at the edge of his booth. Water dripped from the hem of the rain slicker onto the floor. She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown, very dark, with that wet brightness that comes right before tears that the person is refusing to let fall. She leaned forward on her toes and she whispered, actually whispered, close enough that he could smell rain and something sugary, a child's smell, fruit candy or juice. Please pretend to be my dad. Min-jae held very still. In the years that followed, when he turned this moment over in his mind, and he would turn it over many times, he was never able to fully explain what happened in the 2 seconds after she said those words. He was not a sentimental man. He had done things that precluded sentimentality as a serious option. He had ordered men hurt. He had moved money that destroyed communities. He had looked the other way on things that, if examined in the daylight, he could not have looked at for long. He had built something powerful, and he had built it out of materials that left marks on the hands. And in 2 seconds he looked at this child and made a calculation that was not, in any way he could honestly account for, a calculation at all. It was something more basic, something that worked faster than thought. He looked back toward the window. The black SUV was still there. While he was watching, the front passenger door opened. A man stepped out. Then the rear door. 2 more men. All 3 wore dark clothing, nothing remarkable. The kind of nothing remarkable that was its own kind of remarkable if you knew what to look for. They moved without hesitation across the wet sidewalk toward the restaurant entrance. Purposeful. Spread apart just slightly. Not the natural clustering of civilians, the deliberate spacing of men who'd been trained to not bunch up in a breach situation. Min-jae looked back at the girl. He looked at her braids. The beads. He was looking for something specific now because his mind had already assembled a partial picture, and it was pointing at one thing in particular, and he needed to confirm it before he did anything else. His eyes moved over the beads, some plastic, some wood, a few metallic-looking ones, and then he found it. 3rd braid on the left, near the base, a bead that was slightly heavier looking than the others, titanium finish, slightly larger diameter, the kind of size and weight that could house, say, a low-frequency GPS transmitter the size of a watch battery. They'd been tracking her, and she'd walked into a restaurant, which meant they knew exactly where she was. Min-jae slid out of the booth. He didn't make a production of it. He just moved, smooth and unhurried, came around to her side, and sat back down in the seat across from where he'd been, so that now he was between her and the front door and she was against the wall on the inside of the booth. He did not touch her. He put his menu in front of her. "Sit down," he said. His voice was low, level, no drama in it. "Can you eat?" She climbed into the booth without being told twice. He raised 2 fingers toward Mrs. O's direction without looking, the universal sign for more of whatever's easiest. Mrs. O had known him long enough to understand he was signaling something other than hunger, but she was also the kind of woman who had survived enough complicated situations to know that what you do in those moments is keep moving and keep your face neutral and bring the food. The front door opened. The 3 men came in. Cold air again, louder rain for a moment, then the door swinging shut. Min-jae had his phone on the table and his eyes on it, the posture of a man mildly distracted by a screen. In his peripheral vision, he tracked them, two staying near the entrance, one moving slowly into the room, scanning. The scanner was good. He moved casually, hands loose, but his eyes weren't casual. They were cutting the room in a grid pattern, moving from face to face. He was looking for the girl, which meant he hadn't spotted her yet, which meant Min-jae's body was blocking her from the initial sightline from the door. Min-jae put his phone flat on the table. "What's your name?" he said quietly. She looked at him over the top of the menu, which she was holding up, maybe hiding behind it, maybe pretending to read it. Hard to tell with a 7-year-old. "Zuri," she said. "How old are you, Zuri?" 7.5. "Okay, Zuri, I'm going to need you to do something for me. I need you to look at the menu and not look toward the door. Can you do that?" She lowered the menu half an inch and looked at him with an expression that was, despite everything, slightly evaluating, sizing him up. "Are those the monsters?" she said. He blinked. "My dad said if bad people came, they'd look like regular people but move like monsters." Min-jae processed that. "Your dad's smart," he said. "Was," she said. That one syllable landed like a stone dropped into still water. He watched her face when she said it, the slight flicker, the press of her lips together, the controlled way she dropped her eyes back to the menu, and he understood several things at once, none of them good. "Don't look up," he said. He pulled out his phone. Under the table, where the screen wasn't visible to the room, he opened a contact labeled in Korean characters that translated roughly to building manager and typed a 4-character code. The code meant, "Back exit, now, standing by." The response came in 11 seconds, a single character, "Confirmed." The scanner had completed his first pass of the room and was now making a second, slower one. He was going to reach the back booths in about 40 seconds. At this distance, in this light, with Min-jae's body position, he might miss Zuri for another pass. Might. That wasn't a margin Min-jae was interested in working with. Mrs. Oh appeared at the booth with a bowl of myeok-guk and a small plate of banchan. Min-jae looked up at her. "The back," he said in Korean. Just that. And Mrs. O looked at him for exactly 1 second, and then looked at the small girl in the rain slicker and nodded once and walked back toward the kitchen without changing her pace. Min-jae stood up. He put $200 on the table, significantly more than anything that had been ordered. And he put his hand briefly on the back of Zuri's booth, not touching her, just a presence. "Okay, Zuri, we're going to walk to the kitchen. You're going to hold my hand, and you're going to keep talking to me about anything. What's your favorite animal?" She slid out of the booth. He watched her reach up and take his hand, small fingers wrapping around his damaged knuckles, not hesitating, just taking the hand like it was a fact. And something shifted in his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to name right then. "Elephants," she said, "because they remember everything." "Good choice," he said, and walked her toward the kitchen. They made it through the kitchen door before the scanner finished his third pass. The kitchen was hot and smelled of rendered fat and garlic and the chemical edge of industrial soap. Mrs. O's 2 cooks had already moved to the far side of the space, not watching, not asking. Mrs. O stood at the rear exit door, which opened onto a narrow service alley. She had Zuri's hand for exactly the 3 seconds it took to pass her through the doorway, and then Min-jae was through and the door was closing behind them. The alley was dark and wet and smelled of grease trap and rain-soaked cardboard. A black car was idling 30 feet to the left, its exhaust rising in the cold air. Behind the wheel was a man named Park Sung-ho, who had been with Min-jae for 9 years and had the particular quality of silence that made him excellent at situations that required not talking. Min-jae opened the rear door. "Get in," he said to Zuri. She got in without asking where they were going. He registered that. Registered the fact that a 7-year-old in a crisis was operating on pure trust extended to a stranger because she had nothing else available. And he registered what that meant about what she'd already been through tonight before she ever walked into that restaurant. He got in the front. "Go," he said to Sung-ho. The car pulled out of the alley. He turned around as they hit the street. Through the rear window, he could see the front of Haenyo, the lights, the neon, and the 3 men who had come back outside now and were standing on the sidewalk, one of them with a phone to his ear, all three looking up and down the street with the controlled urgency of people who could not afford to look urgent in public. They hadn't run. They'd stayed controlled. That told him something. These were not street-level operators. These were people with training, and more importantly, with the discipline to absorb a miss and adjust rather than break formation. That was a different order of problem than he'd initially been working with when they were just three men stepping out of an SUV. He turned back around. They were moving west on Olympic now, the rain still heavy, streetlights smearing across the wet windshield. "Zuri," he said, "I need to ask you some questions and I need you to answer them as best you can. Can you do that?" She was in the middle of the back seat, the rain slicker still dripping, her hands folded in her lap. Her feet didn't reach the floor. She was looking at the back of his seat, and then she looked up and met his eyes in the rear-view mirror. "Yes," she said. "Where's your father right now?" The look in her eyes changed. Something shifted behind them. Not collapse, not tears, but something older and heavier than a 7-year-old should have been carrying around in her face. "He told me to run," she said. "He said if they came to the apartment, I should take my bag and run and find someone strong." "When did he tell you that?" "A long time ago. Months. He practiced with me." She paused. "He said he would find me after. He said he always finds me." Another pause. "He didn't answer his phone." Min-jae kept his face even. "How many times did you call?" "A lot." "Okay." He looked at Sung-ho. Sung-ho had the particular quality of seeming not to have heard anything while clearly having heard everything. "We're going to the Griffith house," Min-jae said. Sung-ho nodded. Min-jae turned back to look at Zuri through the mirror. "You said you have a bag. The backpack?" She had it in her lap. He'd seen it when she'd settled into the seat. A small child's backpack, dark blue, with what looked like a cartoon elephant on the front pocket. She looked down at it and then back up at him. "My dad packed it," she said. "He said not to let anyone take it." "I'm not going to take it, but I need to know what's in it. Will you tell me?" She thought about this with a seriousness that he found in some corner of himself he hadn't used in a long time. Remarkable. A 7-year-old parsing trustworthiness in real time. "Pictures," she said finally. "Papers. And a note from my dad." "Okay," he said. "Don't open it yet. Wait until we're somewhere safe." "Are you going to keep me safe?" He looked at her in the mirror. Her braids were still damp, her face still holding that controlled expression that was the shape of a child imitating adult composure and mostly succeeding through sheer will. "Yes," he said. He did not add qualifiers. He did not say "I'll try" or "I'll do my best" or any of the hedging language that adults use to give themselves room to fail without being held accountable for it. He just said yes, and he said it the way he said things when he meant them completely, which was quietly, without performance. She looked at him for another moment and then looked out the window at the rain. The Griffith house was not in Griffith Park. It was a property in Los Feliz that Min-jae's syndicate used as a layover safe house, a 3-bedroom craftsman on a residential block, maintained by a rotating team of 2, always stocked, never in Min-jae's name in any document that existed. The neighborhood was quiet. The house had a detached garage, which is where Sung-ho pulled in, cutting the headlights before turning into the driveway. Inside the house was warm, clean. Whoever had been through on the last rotation had left it in order. Dishes put away, heat on a timer, a bowl of apples on the kitchen counter that were 2 days old but still fine. Zuri stood in the kitchen and looked around with the systematic attention she'd given the restaurant. "You can take your raincoat off," Min-jae said. "There's a bathroom down the hall. There are towels." She looked at him. "Will you wait here?" "Yes." She disappeared down the hall. He heard the bathroom door close and then the sound of water running, and he stood in the kitchen and thought for about 30 seconds. 30 seconds of raw, uninterrupted thinking that he allowed himself because he had a habit of not starting problems until he understood their shape, and then he took out his phone. He made 3 calls. The first to his operations director, a man named Cho Dae-won, waking him. He told Cho to find out everything that could be found in the next 90 minutes about a journalist named Malcolm Carter in Los Angeles. Address, employer, current status, most recent activity. He did not explain why. Cho didn't ask. The second call was to his head of security, a woman named Yi Soo-jin, to have a full team move to the Griffith house without sirens or spectacle within the hour. The third call was to a man who did certain technical work for the syndicate and who he reached on a number that changed monthly. He told this man he needed to sweep for a GPS transmission source on a small metallic bead, approximately 8 millimeters diameter, titanium casing, possibly military grade. "Bring it to me tomorrow," the tech man said. "I need it in 2 hours," Min-jae said. Brief pause. "Then bring it here." Min-jae hung up. He set the phone on the counter and found a glass and filled it with water and drank it standing at the sink, looking at the rain against the kitchen window. Zuri came back. She'd taken the rain slicker off. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt and jeans and small sneakers, and someone had clearly dressed her in a hurry because the shirt was on inside out. She'd dried her face and her braids were still damp, but she'd tried to straighten them with her fingers. She still had the backpack on. She sat down at the kitchen table. "Are you hungry?" he said. She thought about it, which meant she probably was, but had learned to be uncertain about saying so. "Maybe," she said. He found bread and peanut butter in the cabinet. The house was stocked for function, not cuisine, and made her a sandwich without asking further. He put it in front of her and found a juice box in the refrigerator from a case someone had stocked at some point and put that down too. And she ate with the focused efficiency of a child who was hungrier than maybe had suggested. While she ate, he sat across from her and didn't push anything. After a few minutes, she put the sandwich down and looked at him. "My dad said I should only trust someone if they do something before they explain why," she said. "You got me out before you asked me anything." He nodded. "My dad's like that too. He does things first." Past tense again. He noticed she was slipping between tenses, said is, does, the way people do when they know something but haven't let themselves land on it yet. He didn't correct it. "What does your dad do?" he asked. "He writes stories," she said, "about when bad people do bad things and nobody's supposed to know. He says somebody has to write it down." "A journalist?" "Yes. He works for a newspaper, but also he does his own research. He calls it the important work." She reached for the juice box. He said the story he was working on was the most important one he'd ever found. He was scared about it. She looked up. "My dad doesn't scare easy." "No," Min-jae said. "I don't think he does." He said kids were disappearing, Zuri said. He said people who were supposed to find them were actually the ones hiding them. She said it with the flat, factual delivery of a child repeating something exactly as it was told to her, without yet having the framework to fully understand what it meant. He said it went all the way to the top. He said that's why it was so dangerous. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. In his chest, something was settling into place the way a joint settles when it's been slightly dislocated and then suddenly isn't. A click, a pressure releasing, a new clarity. The port, the dead men. The federal evidence marker with the designation that didn't officially exist. The black SUV tracking a 7-year-old across Koreatown on a Wednesday night in the rain. He reached across the table. "Zuri, I need to look at your braids for a moment. I'm going to touch them, okay? I'll be careful." She tilted her head toward him without pulling back. He moved carefully through the braids with 2 fingers, searching by touch, now that he could confirm by direct contact. He found the bead in 11 seconds. It felt exactly as he'd assessed it, slightly heavier than the decorative beads around it, the texture of the surface slightly different, a faint seam running along the midline where 2 casing halves had been joined. He did not remove it yet. That required proper tools and a specific technique. If you just pulled it, you could crack the casing and trigger an emergency transmission. He had a man for this. "There's something in one of your beads," he said, "a small device that lets people know where you are." She went very still. "That's how they found me?" "Yes. My dad put it there," she said. Then, after a beat, "to keep track of me, in case something happened." Then, after another beat, quieter, "He didn't think about them getting it." "He couldn't have known everything," Min-jae said. He kept his voice level. Not reassuring us, he had a distrust of false reassurance, just factual. "He thought it was for your protection. He was trying to protect you." She was quiet. "What was in the note he put in your bag?" Min-jae asked. "I haven't read it yet." She looked down at the backpack in her lap. "I was scared to." You don't have to read it right now. She was quiet for another moment. Then she unzipped the front pocket of the backpack and reached in and produced a folded piece of paper, regular paper, folded into quarters. She didn't unfold it. She held it in both hands and looked at it. He has bad handwriting, she said. He always makes me read his notes because I can read his writing better than anyone. She pressed her lips together. The controlled look was harder to hold now. Her chin was doing something, a slight quiver that she was fighting by setting her jaw. He used to say I was his best editor. Min-jae waited. She unfolded the note. Her eyes moved across it. Slow at first, then faster. He watched her face, watched the way she read it, the way a person reads something they need to absorb completely before they let themselves respond to it. When she finished, she folded it again, carefully, along the same creases. She looked up at him. He says your name will be on the side of the memory chip, she said. He says to find the strongest person who does things first and trust them with the chip. She swallowed. He says he loves me. Pause. He says he'll find me. The present tense. She'd read it in the present tense. He let it stay there. What memory chip? He said. The bead, she said. He says the bead isn't just a tracker. He says the tracker is the cover. The bead is a chip with everything on it. She looked at him with those very dark, very steady eyes. He says it'll make sense to the right person. Min-jae sat back. He thought about the implications of what she'd just told him for approximately 4 seconds, which was enough time for the picture to rearrange itself considerably. A journalist investigating what sounded like a federal-level trafficking operation, running his own encryption, hiding evidence in his daughter's hair. Not because he didn't have safer options, because he knew that if things went wrong, the only person they wouldn't immediately strip search was a 7-year-old in a rain slicker. Malcolm Carter had been very, very smart. And Min-jae suspected very, very dead. He didn't say that last part. He kept it behind his face where it belonged for now. Okay, he said. I'm going to need to bring someone in tomorrow to take the bead out of your hair without breaking it. It'll take about 15 minutes and it won't hurt. Can you do that? Yes, she said. Bichette, tonight you're going to sleep here. There's a bedroom down the hall. My people will be outside. He paused. You're safe tonight. I give you my word. She looked at him for a long moment. What's your name? She said. He hesitated. In his life, his name functioned as a warning or a currency. It was rarely just a name. To this child, it would mean neither of those things, and he found, surprisingly, that he wanted it to mean neither. Min-jae, he said. She tried it. Min-jae. The pronunciation was close. Is that a Korean name? Yes. My dad knows a lot of Korean people. He says Korea has good food and complicated history. She said it with the cadence of someone quoting. Then, he's right about the food. He is, Min-jae said. She nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and climbed down from the chair with the backpack. She stopped at the kitchen doorway and turned back. Min-jae, she said, did you decide to help me because you're a good person? He looked at her. He didn't lie to children as a rule. Not the kind of clean lie that patches over a difficult truth. He thought about what he actually was, what the Baeko Syndicate actually was, what his hands had actually done. I don't know if I'm a good person, he said, but I decided to help you. She considered this with the same seriousness she'd considered the sandwich. Okay, she said. That's enough. She went to bed. He sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after that, listening to the rain slow and then stop, listening to the silence of the house settling around him, listening to the particular quality of quiet that a sleeping child produces, a weight of trust placed without negotiation, an expectation of safety assumed without evidence. His phone buzzed at 1:47 a.m. It was Cho Dae-won. Min-jae read the message once. He set the phone down on the table. He looked at his hands, the left with its rings, the right with its crooked knuckle, and he stayed very still for a moment in the way he stayed still when something required the full weight of his attention. Malcolm Carter, 38 years old, award-winning investigative journalist at the LA Chronicle, had been found in his car in a parking structure in Century City at 10:14 p.m. A single gunshot wound. No witnesses. The car was already surrounded by 2 units of LAPD and 2 unmarked federal vehicles by the time the first call came in. which meant, as Cho's message noted with the precise neutrality of a man who understood implications, that someone with a federal badge had been notified before the first 911 call. Min-jae thought about a girl who kept slipping between tenses when she talked about her father. He thought about a note that said, "He'll find me." He thought about what it was going to cost him to do what he was already certain he was going to do. Then he stopped thinking about the cost. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Daewon," he said when it connected, "I need everything you have on a federal task force. Non-public designation. They're operating out of the port." He paused. "And I need you to find out who signs their funding." "That's going to take time," Cho said. "I have some," Min-jae said. "Not much." He hung up. Down the hall, behind a closed door, a 7-year-old girl named Zuri Carter was sleeping in a safe house belonging to one of the most dangerous men in Los Angeles. In her braids, nestled among the beads her father had placed there with careful hands, was a titanium capsule containing evidence that had already gotten one man killed, and was about to bring down something so large that neither of them, not the crime boss nor the sleeping child, could yet see its full shape from where they were standing. Min-jae turned off the kitchen light. He sat in the dark and waited for morning. And somewhere in the back of his mind, moving slow and quiet, like something that had been underground a long time and was only just beginning to surface, a question was forming that he didn't yet have the words for. Something about what a man owes the world when he has taken more from it than he has given, and whether the debt can be settled in a single act or whether it has to be paid in the long, grinding way, day after day, choice after choice, until either the debt is gone or the man is. He didn't answer it. Not yet. But the question stayed. Oh. The tech man's name was Ryu Hyun-seok, and he worked out of a converted auto shop in Cypress Park that smelled permanently of solder flux and machine oil and the particular chemical sweetness of circuit board cleaner. He was 44 years old and had 3 fingers missing on his right hand from an incident 11 years ago that he did not discuss, and he was the best electronic forensics person Min-jae had ever worked with, which was why Min-jae had kept him alive and employed and occasionally annoyed for the better part of a decade. They arrived at the shop at 6:47 in the morning. Zuri had slept 4 hours. Min-jae had slept none. Ryu looked at the girl, looked at Min-jae, looked back at the girl, and said nothing. He pulled a stool up to his work table and gestured for her to sit, and when she climbed onto it and tilted her head toward him with the cooperative patience of a child who had been through enough that a stranger looking at her braids barely registered on her alarm scale, he put on a magnifying headset and went to work. It took 9 minutes. He used a pair of fine-tipped ceramic forceps that he'd made himself and a releasing solvent on a cotton swab barely the size of a pencil eraser. And when the bead came free, he held it up in the light between 2 fingers and turned it slowly. "Military grade," he said. "GPS plus secondary frequency. Whoever built this had access to supply chains that aren't commercial." He set it on a small rubber mat. "The GPS I can kill in 30 seconds. The secondary I'll need to analyze before I touch it." "Kill the GPS first," Min-jae said. Ryu did it in 22 seconds. "The secondary," Min-jae said, "it's also carrying data." Ryu looked at him over the magnifying headset. "How much data?" "I don't know yet." Ryu turned the bead over again. He ran a thumbnail along the seam Min-jae had detected the night before, and his expression shifted into the focused, slightly hungry look he got when something technically interesting presented itself. "The casing's a 2-part press fit. There's a micro USB port inside if I'm reading the seam geometry right." He looked up. "What format?" "Encrypted," Min-jae said. "I don't know the cipher." "Do you want to know the cipher, or do you want what's inside?" "What's inside?" "Then give me 2 hours." Min-jae looked at Zuri. She had been following the conversation with close attention. "You okay?" he said. "It didn't hurt," she said, which answered a question he hadn't asked, which meant she'd been worried about it and was relieved and was now filing it away and moving forward. He was developing a certain appreciation for the speed with which she processed and moved. He found her a chair in the corner of the shop near a space heater and a stack of old car magazines she couldn't possibly have been interested in, but which she flipped through methodically while Ryu worked, giving each page approximately 4 seconds of attention, the way a person reads when their mind is somewhere else entirely, and the reading is just something to do with the hands. Min-jae stood near the shop's side window and watched the street. His phone had been producing a steady stream of messages since 5 a.m. His operations director, his security head, two of his council members who had caught wind that something was happening and wanted to know what. He answered none of them. He was still thinking. At 7:23, his phone rang. Not a message, an actual call, which Cho Dae-won only did when text was insufficient. He picked up. "Talk," he said. "The task force designation," Cho said. He sounded like a man who had also not slept. "I found it. It's buried, but it's there. Joint Federal Initiative, officially under the umbrella of the Department of Justice Human Trafficking Response Division. Been active 7 years. The public record shows a standard law enforcement mandate, investigating trafficking networks through port cargo chains. And the non-public record is what's interesting." Min-jae could hear Cho pulling something up on a keyboard. "The funding chain is clean on the surface, standard appropriations. But 2 layers down, there are discretionary line items that route through a national security budget category that doesn't get standard oversight review, which means whoever runs it answers to themselves," Min-jae said. "Effectively. And the name at the top of the internal command structure, not the public face, the actual operational authority." Cho paused. "Victor Hargrove, Deputy Director, Office of Strategic Coordination. He's been in federal law enforcement 31 years, built his career on anti-trafficking work. He's got a wall full of commendations, 3 honorary degrees, testified before Congress 4 times on the trafficking crisis." Min-jae was quiet. "He's also," Cho said, "on the guest list for 2 events this year hosted by the Port Authority Board of Directors, one of which was a closed dinner, 7 attendees. Find out who else was at that dinner." "Already working on it. Min-jae." Cho paused again, which was unusual. Cho Dae-won did not pause for effect. When he paused, it was because he was calculating whether to say something. "This is federal level. This is not the kind of thing I know what it is. Our business depends on a certain equilibrium with federal Dae-won." "Yes." "A child's father was shot in a parking structure last night. She's 7 years old. She's sitting 10 feet from me looking at pictures of cars she can't drive." He kept his voice flat. "Find out who was at the dinner." Cho said nothing for a moment, then, "Yes, okay." Min-jae hung up. He turned away from the window. Across the shop, Yi Soo-jin had arrived without him hearing her, which was both her greatest professional attribute and, occasionally, irritating. She was 37, compact, and wore her black hair pulled back with the functional indifference of someone who had stopped thinking about it years ago. She stood just inside the shop's rear door with her arms crossed, and her eyes moving between Min-jae and the girl in the corner with the car magazines. And her expression was a specific kind of careful that Min-jae had learned to read as her doing arithmetic she hadn't finished yet. He walked to her. "Talk," he said, quieter now. "The 3 men from last night," she said. "I pulled the SUV's plate. Rental, cash transaction, false ID. Good false ID, not street level. The rental location is an airport counter that has federal account billing set up for law enforcement vehicle use." She met his eyes. "The false ID was used to avoid the federal account trace. But the vehicle itself came out of an allocation pool that's flagged in our customs contact system as associated with one specific task force." She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. "They know she's gone," Min-jae said. "They know she's gone. They don't know where she is yet. The GPS went offline." She glanced at Ryu's workbench. "Presumably just now. When it went offline, they'll run a last known location query. It'll put her at the restaurant." "Mrs. O, I already sent 2 people. She's fine. She says 3 men came back in after you left, asked if she'd seen a little girl. She said no, they left. She didn't push anything." Yi paused. "She also said to tell you she's charging you for the table you abandoned. Tell her I'll pay double." "I already told her that." Yi looked at Zuri again. The arithmetic was still running in her face. "Minji, what are we doing here?" It was not a question. It was the beginning of a conversation he'd known was coming. "What we're doing," he said, "is looking at what's on that chip. And after that we decide the next step." Yi looked at him steadily. "The council is going to want a meeting. The council can want whatever they like. That's not..." She stopped, recalibrated. "Lee Byung-chul called me at 6 this morning. He wants to know if the girl is connected to the port situation. Min-jae felt something tighten in his jaw. How does Lee know about the girl? He doesn't know specifics. He knows you left a restaurant last night with an unidentified package and went dark from communications for several hours. He's drawing inferences. Tell Lee I'll speak to him this afternoon. He's not going to like. I didn't ask what he'd like. He was quiet for a moment. She had the kind of face that didn't reveal much when she decided to keep it closed, but he'd worked with her long enough to read the things around the edges. The slight set of her mouth, the way she breathed through her nose when she was controlling a response. She was controlling one now. Say it, he said. This is not our fight, she said. The port situation is our problem because it affects our operations. A federal task force playing both sides of the trafficking trade. That's information we could use, it's leverage, it's a negotiating position. But you're talking about taking it somewhere else. You're talking about using it against them. That's not leverage. That's a war we did not vote to start. She kept her voice very even. The council has a voice in wars. The council has a voice in syndicate business, Min-jae said. This is not syndicate business. Then what is it? He looked at her. She looked back. Her eyes were very direct and slightly cold. Not because she was a cold person, but because she'd learned that in certain conversations with certain men, warmth was a concession she couldn't afford. It's mine, he said simply. She held the look for another 3 seconds. Then she dropped it. Not in defeat, in the particular way of someone who knows when a decision has already been made, and arguing further is spending resources on a fixed point. Okay, she said, keep the council quiet until this afternoon, and I need a second location, not the Griffith House, somewhere further out. How far? Far enough that if someone runs a net across LA County, they're not in it. He nodded once. She was already reaching for her phone. Ryu called from the workbench. Got it open. Min-jae crossed the shop. The bead sat on the rubber mat, its 2 casing halves separated, the interior visible under Ryu's magnifying light. A chip the size of a thumbnail, matte black, with a micro-connector along one edge. Ryu had it connected to a purpose-built reader he'd assembled from what appeared to be 3 different devices. His screen showed a directory. Min-jae looked at it. The files were organized by date going back 14 months, folders labeled with what appeared to be shipping manifest reference codes. Inside the top-level directory, a subfolder labeled Secondary, and inside that 3 items, a video file, an audio file, and a document simply labeled Read. Open the document, Min-jae said. Ryu opened it. It was a letter, not formal, a personal letter, handwritten and then photographed. The image clear enough to read every word. Min-jae read it standing over Ryu's shoulder, and he read it carefully, the way he read things that required him to understand not just what was said, but what the person was like when they wrote it. Malcolm Carter had been meticulous and terrified and very, very clear-headed. The letter laid out, in plain sequential language, the full shape of what he'd found, the task force's dual function, the cargo routing system they'd embedded inside legitimate port operations, the network of shell organizations receiving payment for what the manifest described as logistics consulting. Children moved as freight, documented, photographed. The photographs were in the dated folders. Malcolm had written, "If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. I'm sorry about that. I tried to find a way to finish this without that happening. I don't think I succeeded. What matters now is that Zuri is safe and that this information reaches someone who can use it without being killed for it. I've thought hard about who that person could be. I kept coming back to the same answer. Someone who operates outside the system they're trying to take down. Someone who has their own power. Someone who has reason to want this particular machine broken. If you're reading this and you fit that description, please. She trusted you enough to give you this. Honor that." At the bottom of the letter, in different handwriting, a child's handwriting, slightly crooked, the letters large and careful, were 4 words. Please help my dad. Min-jae straightened up. He stood with his back to the room for a moment. His right hand was at his side, and he was aware of it. The crooked knuckle, the weight of it, the things it had done. He was also aware, in the way that happens when something you've kept at a distance suddenly closes the gap, of a feeling he couldn't categorize cleanly. It sat between rage and grief, and something older than both of them, something that didn't have a clean name in Korean or English. Behind him he heard a small sound and turned. Zuri was standing 4 feet away. She'd put the car magazine down. She was looking at the screen. She could read. She'd read fast. Her face was completely still in the way that a face goes completely still when it's working very hard to contain something that wants to come apart at the seams. Her eyes were dry. Her hands were at her sides, both of them, fingers slightly curled. "He knew," she said. Her voice was careful and flat and quiet. He knew this was going to happen. Min-jae looked at her. "He practiced with me," she said. "The running, finding someone. He didn't do that because he thought he might get in trouble. He did it because he knew." She swallowed. The chin quiver from the night before was there again, and again she was fighting it, and again she was mostly winning. "He didn't tell me he knew. He was trying to protect you. I know that." She said it fast, not angry, but with the precision of someone who had already processed that part and was past it. "I know why he did it. I just—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "He knew, and he went anyway." "Yes." "Because he thought it was worth it." "Yes." She looked at the screen, at the directory of folders, at the dates going back 14 months. 14 months of careful, meticulous, dangerous work. The shape of a man's last year. "Was he right?" she said. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the files, at the photographs Malcolm had documented. He'd seen only the first folder, only a few images, and had looked away from those because they were not the kind of thing a person looked at for long. He thought about what was in those folders. He thought about the scope of it. He thought about the word network and what it implied, the scale, the duration, the number of people who had looked the other way, or been paid to look the other way, or been threatened into looking the other way, and the children who had moved through shipping containers while all of that looking away was happening. "Yes," he said. He was right. She stood very still for another second. Then she nodded once, sharp, the kind of nod that is a door closing on a room you can't afford to stand in. She turned and walked back to her stool. She climbed onto it. She picked up the car magazine. She did not cry. Min-jae turned back to the screen. Ryu had the presence of mind to have minimized the letter without being asked. "Can you copy everything to a clean drive?" Min-jae said. "Already started," Ryu said. "Double redundancy. Always. And the original chip stays with me." Ryu glanced at him sideways. "You know what you're sitting on." "Yes." "People have died for less interesting information." "I know. The people who want this back are not—" "Ryu." Min-jae looked at him. "How long have you worked for me?" "A beat. 9 years." "Have I ever put you in a situation that wasn't survivable?" Ryu thought about it with genuine seriousness. "Twice it was close," he said, "but survivable. Both times." He paused. "Technically. Copy the files. Double redundancy. I'll need an encrypted send protocol to a destination I'll give you in an hour. Can you do that without the transmission being traced back to this location?" "I can route it through 4 nodes in 3 countries," Ryu said. "By the time anyone traces it, it'll look like it originated in Tallinn, Estonia." "Do that," Min-jae said. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from Cho-dae-won, 3 lines. "Dinner guest list confirmed. 7 attendees. Hargrove, 2 Port Authority directors, a federal judge, 9th Circuit, 1 state senator, and 2 private. The private names are in the system, but not in any public record. One of them, Raymond Krauss, shows up in shipping records connected to 4 of the manifest codes in the journalist's files. And then, a 4th line that Cho had clearly hesitated before sending. Min-jae, Krauss has a direct line to 2 members of our supply chain. If we move against this network, we will lose those lines. The council will consider that an act of financial self-destruction." Min-jae read the message twice. He thought about Lee Byung-chul calling Yi at 6 in the morning. He thought about the council and the equilibrium they'd built and the money that flowed through that equilibrium, and the parts of it he'd never looked at too closely because looking too closely at the foundations of something profitable is how you end up paralyzed. He thought about a man who'd written a letter in the knowledge that he probably wasn't going to survive what he'd started. He typed back to Cho, "Schedule a council meeting for 4 p.m. Make it mandatory. And get me a name. Federal prosecutor, clean, no connections to the task force or the Port Authority, someone who won't run." He sent it. He put his phone in his pocket. He looked at the room. Ryu with his back to him, the drives duplicating. Zuri on her stool with her car magazine, and her 7-year-old face doing all the quiet, ferocious work of holding something enormous at a manageable distance. Yi by the door, phone out, already arranging what needed arranging. He had a council meeting in 9 hours that was going to go badly regardless of how he played it. He had a federal prosecutor to identify and contact without triggering a surveillance net that was almost certainly already looking for the missing chip. He had a child who had slept 4 hours and eaten a peanut butter sandwich and read her dead father's letter with her chin up, and was now pretending to read an article about a car she would not be able to drive for another 9 years. He had evidence that could dismantle a federal conspiracy and also, potentially, take apart a significant portion of the infrastructure his syndicate depended on. He had no clean options. Every path forward cost something that couldn't be recovered. This was, he thought, what the point of no return actually felt like. Not dramatic, not loud, just the specific quiet of standing in a converted auto shop at 8 in the morning, smelling solder and machine oil, knowing that every road back had closed while he wasn't looking, and the only direction left was forward into something he couldn't see the far end of. He looked at Zuri. She looked up from the magazine, met his eyes. "Min Jae?" she said. "Yes." "My dad's not coming to find me." He held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not give her anything false to hold on to. "No," he said. She looked at him for 3 more seconds. Something moved through her face, not breaking, not collapsing, something more like a settling, a weight accepted rather than dropped. Then she said very quietly, "Did he stop them?" And Min Jae looked at the copied files on Ryu's screen, at 14 months of work sitting in a directory, at the thing Malcolm Carter had spent his last year building and hidden in his daughter's hair because he trusted that the right person would know what to do with it. He looked back at Zuri. "Not yet," he said, "but he's going to." Her eyes stayed on his. "We're going to finish it for him," Min Jae said. She held the look for another moment. Then she nodded, that same sharp, door-closing nod, and looked back down at the magazine. Min Jae's phone buzzed again. He looked at it. The message was from a number he didn't recognize. Untraceable format. 7 words. "We know the chip exists, give it back." And then, after a pause, a second message, same number. "Or we take the girl." Min Jae stared at the message for 4 seconds. Not long. 4 seconds was enough for his mind to run the geometry of it. The implications, the speed, the precision. Someone had tracked the GPS going offline and moved fast enough to get an untraceable message to a number that was supposed to be clean. That meant either the number had been compromised, which meant his internal communications had a leak, or they'd run a wider net than he'd estimated and caught the signal on a different thread entirely. Either option was bad. One was worse. He looked up at Yi. She read his face. "What?" He turned the phone toward her. She read it. He watched her jaw tighten by a fraction, the only external sign she permitted herself. She looked up. "How long ago did the GPS drop?" she said to Ryu. 11 minutes, Ryu said without turning around. 11 minutes to trace, source an untraceable line, and send. She looked at Min Jae. "That's not reaction time. That's preparation. They had protocols in place for when the chip went dark." "Yes," Min Jae said. "Which means they planned for the possibility of someone pulling it." "Yes." "Which means they know more about Malcolm Carter's backup system than we assumed." "Yes." He pocketed the phone. "We need to move." Yi was already at the door. "I have a location in Ventura County, horse property, residential, registered to a private family trust that's 11 layers removed from anything Baco. I've used it twice. It's clean." "How long to get there?" "Hour and 10. Maybe less." He turned to Ryu. "The drives?" 3 minutes, Ryu said. He was already pulling cables. Min Jae crossed to Zuri. She was already standing. She'd heard the change in the room's temperature before anyone explained it to her, the slight acceleration of movement, the drop in ambient conversation. She had the backpack on. "We're moving again," he said. "Okay," she said. "You doing all right?" She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "I'm scared," she said. Just that. Not as a confession, as a report. A 7-year-old giving him accurate field intelligence. "That's correct?" he said. Being scared right now is the right response. She absorbed this. Are you scared? He thought about lying, decided against it, same as the night before. Yes, he said. She nodded. Okay, she said again, and the word did a lot of work. It contained acknowledgement and acceptance, and a kind of grim forward momentum that he was starting to recognize as her fundamental operating mode. Ryu handed him 2 drives, one standard black, one wrapped in a second casing of impact-resistant rubber. Min-jae put one in his jacket's interior pocket and handed the other to Yi without explanation. She pocketed it without asking why. The original chip went into a small metal case the size of a matchbox that Min-jae carried in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his sternum. The case was lined with a signal-dampening material. Whatever frequency the chip might still be passively emitting would be contained. They were out of the shop in 4 minutes. The drive to Ventura County was quiet. Zuri sat in the back between Min-jae and a security operative named Jin, who had the particular quality of seeming like furniture until the moment he didn't. Sung-ho drove. Yi was in a separate vehicle 30 seconds behind them, running counter-surveillance, communicating through earpiece. Min-jae spent 40 minutes of the drive on his phone. The council meeting at 4 p.m. was becoming a problem he could no longer defer. Cho had sent a follow-up. Lee Byung-chul had called 2 other council members, which meant the informal alignment was already starting, which meant by 4 p.m., Min-jae would not be walking into a meeting so much as walking into a verdict that had been written before he arrived. He called Cho directly. The council, he said. Lee has Park Sung-woo and Kwon Tae-il, Cho said. 3 of the 7 voting seats. He needs 1 more for a binding motion. Who's he working on? Ha Ji-young. Min-jae thought about Ha Ji-young. 61, the eldest on the council, had been with the syndicate since before Min-jae took leadership. Careful, financially conservative, not given to loyalty as a principle so much as stability as a preference. Lee would frame this as a stability issue. What's the motion going to be? Min-jae said, though he could already predict the shape of it. Based on what Lee's been saying? Cho paused. Mandatory council approval for any action relating to the port situation, which, if they define the port situation broadly enough, effectively ties my hands on everything connected to this. Yes. And if I don't show for the meeting, then Lee calls it an abdication of accountability and the motion passes by default under the bylaws. Cho's voice was carefully neutral. Min-jae, what do you want me to do? Min-jae looked out the window. They were on the 101 now, the Santa Monica Mountains on their right, pale and dry in the morning light, the scrub grass the color of old straw. Zuri was asleep against his arm. She'd gone out fast, the way children go out when they've been running on adrenaline and finally feel contained enough to let go. Her head was against his sleeve, the weight of it slight, her breathing slow and deep. He looked at her for a moment. Tell Lee I'll be at the meeting, he said, and find me a federal prosecutor. Clean. No Port Authority connections, no task force links. I need someone who operates independently, who has a record of cases that went against federal agencies, not with them. Someone who understands that sometimes the machine eats its own. I have a name, Cho said, which surprised him. Already? I started looking last night when you told me about the journalist, before you asked. A brief pause. Her name is Danielle Mercer, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Southern District. She prosecuted 2 federal corruption cases in the last 4 years. Both resulted in convictions against sitting officials. She was removed from a 3rd case 18 months ago, officially restructuring, unofficially because the case was getting close to someone with connections to the DOJ Oversight Committee. She has reason to be angry, Min-jae said. She has reason, and she has skill. She's also, from everything I can find, not reachable. No unusual financial patterns, no connections to the private sector, no social entanglements that suggest she's been positioned. Cho paused. She's genuinely clean, Min-jae, which makes her rare enough to be slightly suspicious, but the record holds up. Get me a secure way to reach her, not through our usual channels. Something clean on our side, too. Ryu's routing. Understood. He hung up. He looked out the window and thought about the council meeting at 4 p.m. and what it was going to cost him to walk into it and walk out with his hands still free. He thought about Lee Byung-chul, who was 63 and had been maneuvering for structural power since before the question was relevant, and who had the kind of patience that came from having waited a long time for the right moment. He thought about whether this was the right moment. From Lee's perspective, yes, unambiguously. Min-jae had gone dark, moved resources without authorization, clearly acquired something that had federal heat attached to it, and was now making decisions that were going to cost the syndicate a supply line. From Lee's perspective, this was either a crisis or an opportunity, and Lee was the kind of man who only recognized one of those two things. The horse property was outside a town called Moore Park, a small ranch set back from the road behind a gate and a long gravel drive, surrounded by dry hills and the occasional stand of oak. The family who nominally owned it were real, an elderly Korean couple named Seo, who had retired to San Diego 7 years ago, and who understood that the trust arrangement that paid their property taxes and maintenance also came with occasional periods of occupancy they were never told about and never asked about. The house was single-story, clean, smelling of cedar and mild disuse. 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a covered porch facing the hills. The horse paddock at the rear of the property was empty. Zuri woke up when the car stopped. She looked at the hills through the window, the dry, golden-brown slopes, the stillness, and then looked at Min-jae. "Horses?" she said, reading the paddock. "Not right now," he said. "I like horses." "I know." He didn't know. He'd said it automatically, and then registered that he'd said it, and registered what it meant that he'd said it. The reflex to give a child something small and good to hold on to. She didn't call him on it. She just looked at the hills. They were inside and settled by 10:40 a.m. Yi ran the perimeter with her 2 operatives. Sung-ho parked the car inside the detached barn. Min-jae sat at the kitchen table with his phone and a cup of coffee that Jin had made from what was in the cabinet. Instant, slightly stale, not worth drinking, but warm. And he worked through the logistics of what the next 6 hours were going to require. His phone rang at 11:17. The number was one of his council members, not Lee. Han Dong-min, the youngest on the council at 44, quiet, competent, the one who ran the syndicate's legitimate business portfolio and who generally aligned with Min-jae on financial decisions because Min-jae's decisions had made them both considerably wealthier than the alternative. "Han," he said, "I need to tell you something before 4 o'clock. Han's voice was low. He was calling from somewhere private. Min-jae could hear the particular acoustic quality of an enclosed space with no ambient noise. "Lee came to me this morning." "I know. He didn't come to me about a vote." Han paused. "He came to me about something else. He told me he's been in communication with a federal contact for the past 3 weeks, someone who approached the syndicate through an intermediary about the port situation." Min-jae went very still. The coffee cup was in his hand. He set it down without looking at where he was setting it. "Go on," he said. "The contact told Lee that the port disruption, our 2 men, the evidence markers, that was not accidental. It was deliberate. They were sending a message. They wanted us to know they were aware of our operations at the port, and they were offering Lee called it an accommodation." Han said the word with a careful blankness that meant he'd chosen it specifically to avoid saying what it actually was. In exchange for the syndicate pulling back from certain cargo routing operations, they would guarantee our other operations at the port continued without interference. Min-jae's hand was flat on the table now. He became aware of it, the spread of his fingers, the pressure against the wood. "Lee accepted this accommodation," he said. "It was not a question." 3 weeks ago, Han said, verbally, no documentation. He told the other council members it was a temporary pause for strategic reasons. He didn't tell them about the contact. A pause. "He didn't tell you." The room was very quiet. Through the kitchen window, Min-jae could see the dry hills in the middle distance, the sky pale and flat above them. He could hear Zuri in the other room, the small sounds of her moving around, opening something, the low sound of her talking to herself the way children do when they're alone. "He's known about this task force for 3 weeks, Min-jae said. "Yes. And when I came in last night with the chip, he would have understood immediately what it was," Han said, "and what it would do to the accommodation." Min-jae thought about Lee calling Yi at 6 in the morning, about the council motion being pre-built before anyone had a meeting, about the speed of it, the coordination, the alignment of 3 votes before Min Jae was even awake enough to see the shape of what was happening. "Han," he said, "the 2 men we lost at the port 3 weeks ago." Silence. "Han." The contact told Lee, Han said carefully, that the 2 men had been identified as a liability to the accommodation, that their removal was, the word used was necessary. The word landed. Min Jae's 2 men, dead in a container yard with federal evidence markers on them before the first call came in. He'd thought that meant the task force had moved faster than his people. He'd been right about that. He'd been wrong about why. They hadn't moved faster. They'd moved first. They'd known exactly where to be and when to be there, because someone had told them. "Lee gave them up," Min Jae said. Han didn't answer, which was its own answer. Min Jae sat with it for a moment. 2 men who had worked for the Baeko Syndicate. Men he'd known by name, whose families he'd made certain arrangements for in the way that his world made arrangements for such things. Dead because Lee Byung-chul had traded them for a phone call with a federal contact who ran a trafficking operation behind a task force badge. He became aware that his jaw was aching. He'd been clenching it. "Thank you," he said to Han. His voice was flat. He made it flat deliberately. "Min Jae, what are you going to do at 4 o'clock?" "What I need to do," he said. He hung up. He sat for a moment without moving. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen counter and put both hands on the edge of it and breathed. 3 breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. An old technique. He'd learned it from a man who was dead now, who'd told him that when you can't run and you can't fight yet, you breathe, because breathing is the only thing that buys you the time to figure out what comes next. The cost of the chip had just changed. He'd understood going into this morning that moving against Hargrove's network would damage the syndicate's port operations. That was a business cost, significant, survivable, the kind of loss that could be absorbed over time. He'd been prepared to absorb it. He had not been prepared for Lee. Lee changed the geometry completely. Because Lee wasn't just a council member who disagreed with Min Jae's choices. Lee was a man who had established a back channel with the exact people Min Jae was now building a case against, which meant that whatever Min Jae brought to the council meeting at 4 p.m., Lee already knew about it, or would know about it within the hour, which meant the council meeting was not a meeting, it was a handoff. Lee was going to use the 4 p.m. session to find out exactly what Min Jae had and then pass it to his federal contact. And if he could use the council's bylaws to strip Min Jae's operational authority in the process, the chip and the girl and the entire play became a syndicate asset that Lee could negotiate with directly. Min Jae pushed off the counter. He walked to the room where Jin was stationed and knocked once. "I need you to go back to the city," he said when Jin opened the door. "Not Sung Ho, you. I need eyes on Lee Byung-chul from this moment until 4 p.m. His location, his calls, his meetings. Anyone he meets with in person gets photographed. Can you do that without being made?" "Yes," Jin said. "Go now." Jin went. Min Jae stood in the hallway and thought. Yi appeared from the direction of the back porch. "Perimeter's clean," she said. "I've got coverage on the access road in the rear. If anyone runs the drive property, we have 4 minutes warning minimum." She read his face. Something happened. Lee gave up our men at the port. She went very still. "Say that again." He said it again, briefly, with the details Han had provided. He watched her absorb it, watched the specific way it moved through her, not just surprise, but something more structural, the wobble that happens when a load-bearing assumption turns out to have been false for longer than you knew. "He's been talking to Hargrove's people," she said, "for 3 weeks. And the meeting at 4 is a mechanism to get what I have and immobilize me at the same time." He paused. "Which means I can't go. If you don't go, the motion passes by default." "I know. They strip your authority, formally, by the bylaws." "I know." She looked at him. Her mouth was slightly open. Not from shock, she didn't do shock, but from the calculation of what he was saying running slightly ahead of what she'd expected to be calculating today. "You're going to let it pass," she said. "If I walk in there, Lee knows everything I know before Mercer does," he said. "The chip goes to Hargrove. Zuri becomes leverage in a negotiation between Lee and a federal trafficking operation. That is not an outcome I'm willing to accept. Min Jae, If you don't walk in there, you lose the council. Yes. You lose the council, you lose the syndicate. He looked at her steadily. I know what I lose, Soo-jin. She held the look. He could see her running it, calculating what it meant for her, for the people under her command, for the structure they'd both operated inside for a decade and a half. He watched her land on it. Watched the moment she made her own decision, separate from his, which was the only kind of decision he'd ever respected from her. Okay, she said. It came out quieter than usual. Then we need to move before 4 o'clock because once the motion passes, Lee will have grounds to pull resources. Security, safe houses, the networks. I know. I need to reach Mercer before that happens. Ryu's routing takes a couple of hours to set up clean. I know. He checked the time, 12:40 p.m., 3 hours and 20 minutes before the council meeting started. Get Ryu on the phone, tell him to start the routing now, and pull Sung-ho up here from the barn. I need him available. She was already moving. Min-jae walked back to the kitchen. Zuri was sitting at the kitchen table now, the backpack in front of her. She had taken something out of it, a photograph, physical, printed, the kind nobody printed anymore. She was looking at it. He sat down across from her without being invited. She turned the photograph to face him, a man. 38 or so, lean, dark-skinned, with a wide smile that reached his eyes, and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was sitting in what looked like a kitchen, a different kitchen, warm-lit, lived in, with something pinned to the refrigerator behind him that was too small to read. He was looking at the camera and he was laughing at something that had happened just before the shutter. That's my dad, Zuri said. Min-jae looked at the photograph for a long moment. He looks like someone who laughs a lot, he said. He does. Present tense. She didn't correct it this time. He's funny. He makes up voices for animals. He does this whole thing where the neighbor's cat is a retired detective. She looked at the photograph. It's stupid, but it's really funny. Min-jae said nothing. I want you to see him, she said. I don't want him to just be the dead journalist. She said dead without flinching, with the directness of a child who has made herself say the true word because the alternative is worse. He's funny, and he eats too much cereal, and he can't whistle, and he... She stopped. Her throat moved. He wrote the most important story, and I want people to know it was him. Min-jae looked at her. They'll know, he said. Promise me. He held her gaze. He was not a man who made promises carelessly. He'd learned what they cost too early in his life for that. He made them rarely, and he kept them completely. I promise, he said. She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned the photograph back and looked at it herself, and there was something in her face, not peace, not comfort, something more like a kind of terrible and absolute resolve that made her look for just a moment, not 7 at all. His phone buzzed. Ryu. A message. Routing initiated. Mercer's secure channel ready in 90 minutes. But Min-jae, I'm getting something else. Someone ran a query on the Griffith property 20 minutes ago. Not a standard search. A federal-level asset location query. The house is burned. Min-jae read it twice. He thought about the timeline. The GPS had gone dark at 6:47 a.m. The untraceable message had arrived 11 minutes later. And now, at 12:43 p.m., nearly 6 hours after the GPS drop, someone had just run an asset query on a safe house that was not in his name, not on any public record, accessible only through layers of shell company documentation that should have taken weeks to trace. Weeks. Not 6 hours, which meant they hadn't traced the shell companies, which meant someone had already known about the Griffith house, which meant the leak wasn't in his communications. The leak was in his personnel. He sat with that for 3 seconds. Then he looked up at the hallway, in the direction Yi had gone. He thought about who knew about the Griffith property. The standing knowledge, people who'd been involved in its use, in its maintenance, in the rotation schedule. He ran the list in his head. It was not a long list. 8 people, maybe 9. He thought about who Lee Byung-chul had access to, who he could have cultivated over 3 weeks of quiet conversations while Min-jae was focused on the port problem and assuming his own house was in order. His jaw was aching again. He stood up and walked to the back porch. The hills were very still in the midday light. The paddock fence cast a thin shadow across the dry dirt. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was doing something repetitive and unmusical in the scrub. He stood on the porch and thought about the 8 or 9 people who knew about the Griffith house, and about which of them Lee Byung-chul had reached, and about the fact that whatever move he made in the next 90 minutes, before Ryu's routing was ready, before he could reach Mercer, before he could get the chip to someone who could do something with it, he was making it with a syndicate that had already been partly turned against him, with a council that was assembling to formally strip his authority, with federal operators who knew more about his infrastructure than he'd believed possible, and with a 7-year-old girl at the kitchen table looking at a photograph of her father and trusting him with a promise he had. He had 90 minutes before Ryu's routing was ready. He used the first 10 of them standing on that back porch running names. 8 people knew about the Griffith house. Yi Soo-jin, Sung Ho, Jin, who was already back in the city, which meant if Jin was the leak, he'd just sent the leak directly to where Lee Byung-chul was operating. Cho Dae-won, 3 members of the rotating maintenance team, and 1 council member who'd needed to know the location 18 months ago for a separate operation entirely. That council member was Ha Ji-young, the one Lee was working on for the 4th vote. Min-jae turned it over twice. Ha Ji-young, 61, financially conservative, a preference for stability over principle. Lee had come to her not just about a vote. Lee had come to her knowing she already held a piece of information, the Griffith location, that he needed. Whether she'd given it willingly, or whether she'd been maneuvered into giving it without understanding what she was giving, he didn't know yet. It didn't change the operational reality, which was that the Griffith house was burned, and by extension any location Ha knew about was potentially burned, and Ha's knowledge of syndicate infrastructure was not limited to one property. He went back inside. Yi was in the hallway on her phone. She looked up when he came in and finished the sentence she was on, something about the access road, and hung up. He looked at her. She looked back. Ha Ji-young, he said. Her expression shifted. Not surprise. The particular quality of someone who has been running the same calculation and has arrived at the same answer and was waiting to see if the other person got there too. How long have you been thinking that? He said. Since you told me about Lee, she said. He's the only council member who knew about Griffith. If the query came back to that property specifically and not to other properties in our network, then whoever ran it was given a specific address rather than running a broad sweep. She paused. A broad sweep would have taken much longer than 6 hours. A specific address takes 11 minutes. 11 minutes, he said. Same as the untraceable message after the GPS drop. They've been coordinated since this morning, Yi said. Lee and whoever he's talking to. When the GPS dropped, they already had Ha on standby. Lee calls Ha. Ha gives him Griffith. Lee's contact runs the federal query. She said it with the flat precision of someone describing the steps of a process. No heat in it, which was how she handled things that, if she let heat into them, would be too hot to hold. They were faster than us because they'd already built the response tree before we knew there was a game, which means they expected the GPS to drop, Min-jae said. They expected someone would pull it. Or they hoped, and prepared for both outcomes. She crossed her arms. Min-jae, this location, if Ha has it, she doesn't. This property is through the CO Trust. The only people who know the CO Trust connection are you, me, and Cho. Yi nodded. The relief was small, but real. How long do we have? 90 minutes until Ryu's routing is live. After that, I can reach Mercer. He looked at the time. The council motion hits at 4. Once it passes, Lee can legitimately request security asset disclosure as part of assuming operational authority, which means this location becomes part of the formal record within the syndicate, which means burned by 6 p.m. at the latest, Yi said. So we move before 4. To where? He'd been thinking about this on the porch. It was the piece he didn't have yet. Where to move Zuri that was genuinely outside the syndicate's knowledge, outside Lee's reach, outside any infrastructure that connected back to Baeko, which meant outside everything he'd spent 15 years building. I know a place, he said. It was not a satisfying answer. Yi's expression said so. It's not syndicate, it's personal. Off every record that exists. He paused. I'll need 2 hours alone with Zuri after I reach Mercer. You'll need to not know where we're going. Yi was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to let you go dark. I'm asking you to hold this location until I contact you. Don't move. Don't call Lee. Don't respond to any syndicate communication that originates from a council channel. If Han Dongmin calls, answer. No one else. And if something happens to you, he looked at her. If something happens to you, she said, steady, and the girl is somewhere I don't know about, and Mercer doesn't know about it, and you're not reachable, then she's just gone. Nothing's going to happen to me in the next 2 hours. That's not a real answer. No, he said. It's not. He held the look. Trust me, Sujin. She held it back for 3 more seconds. I trusted you when you said the port situation was manageable, she said. That was before I knew we had a council member running back channel with federal traffickers. My trust has had a complicated morning. I know. Another second. Go, she said. He went. He found Sung-ho in the kitchen refilling a coffee cup that probably hadn't needed refilling. Sung-ho saw his face and put the cup down. We're driving somewhere, Min-jae said. You and me and the girl. I'll give you the address in the car. Sung-ho nodded once. He reached for his jacket. Min-jae went to the room where Zuri was. She'd moved from the kitchen at some point. She was sitting on the floor against the bed in the room she'd been given, the photograph of her father face up on the floor beside her, the backpack open. She was looking at the ceiling. When he came in, she looked at him. We're moving again, he said. I figured, she said. You have a face. What face? The one where you've already decided and you're just telling me. She stood up with the efficiency of someone who'd been half ready before he knocked. She put the photograph back in the backpack and zipped it. Is it bad? It's complicated, he said. Nothing you need to manage right now. Min-jae? She looked up at him directly. I'm 7.5. I'm not 5. He almost said something softening. Didn't. Someone inside my organization has been talking to the people who killed your father. I have to assume they know more about where we are and what we have than I'd like. We're going somewhere they can't find us. She took that in, processed it without visible collapse. How many people can you trust? She said. Fewer than this morning. She nodded. My dad said that's how it goes when you get close to the truth. The circle gets small. She picked up the backpack. Let's go. The drive took 43 minutes. Ryu sent the confirmation at the 32-minute mark. Routing live, channel open, Mercer's secure contact active for a 6-hour window before it collapsed. Min-jae typed his response to Mercer's channel from the passenger seat while Sung-ho drove, composing it in the controlled, stripped-down language of a person who knew the communication was clean but had the habit of treating every communication as if it might not be. He told her who he was. He did not use the name Baeko. He said, I have evidence in the form of an encrypted chip and complete file copies documenting a federal task force operating a trafficking network through Port of Los Angeles cargo operations for at least 7 years. The evidence was compiled by Malcolm Carter. He's dead. I have his daughter. I am not seeking immunity, protection, or negotiation. I'm seeking an honest prosecutor who will take this to a federal grand jury and not route it through any channel connected to the DOJ Strategic Coordination Office. If you're that prosecutor, respond to this channel within 4 hours. He sent it. He put the phone in his pocket. Zuri was asleep in the back seat again. He didn't know how she kept doing that. The dropping into sleep at will, the absolute surrender to unconsciousness in moving vehicles in crisis conditions. He supposed it was a child's body doing what it needed to do regardless of what the situation was asking for. He envied it, briefly and sincerely. The place he was taking them was a property in the hills above Simi Valley. It had belonged to a man named Choi Won-suk, who had died 6 years ago and left it to Min-jae in a will that Min-jae had not expected and had not publicized and had not sold out of some combination of sentiment and operational instinct that he'd never fully examined. Choi had been his mother's brother, not a syndicate man, not connected to anything Baeko, just an old man who'd built a small house on a lot with a view of the valley and grown persimmons on a south-facing slope and died of a heart attack at 78 while watching television. The property was in Min-jae's personal name through a private trust that predated Baeko by 12 years. It was, as far as he could determine, the only thing in his life that was entirely clean. They arrived at 2:11 p.m. The house was small. 2 rooms, a kitchen, A porch facing west where the valley opened up below in a wide, flat spread of afternoon light. The persimmon trees on the slope were bare in November, the small hard fruit still clinging to the upper branches like decorations. Inside, the air was cold and still, with the specific quality of an unoccupied space. Not musty, just waiting. Min-jae turned the heat on, found 2 blankets in a cedar chest and put one on the couch for Zuri. Sung-ho did a perimeter walk without being asked and came back and stood near the door, which was his way of being present without being intrusive, a quality Min-jae had valued in him for 9 years. Zuri walked to the west-facing window and looked at the valley. "It's pretty," she said. "Yes." "Whose house is it?" "Mine," he said. "Only mine." She turned from the window. Something in how he'd said it seemed to register with her, the specific weight of only mine, the distinction it carried. She looked at him with those evaluating eyes. "You don't have family," she said. It wasn't a question. Not anymore. What happened? He was quiet for a moment. He could have deflected. Didn't. "My mother died when I was 26. I was already in the syndicate by then. She knew what I'd become, and she didn't have a clean way to hold both things. What she knew about me and what she needed to believe about me." He paused. "She managed it until she couldn't. Then she got sick. I think the not managing took more out of her than the sick did." He looked at the window. "I have no one left who knew me before." Zuri was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. A 7-year-old who had lost her father 16 hours ago, offering condolences for a grief he was still carrying after 15 years. He didn't know what to do with that except accept it. "Thank you," he said. His phone buzzed. Mercer. The message was 4 lines. He read it standing in the middle of his dead uncle's kitchen with the heat coming on and the valley light falling through the west window. "I know who you are. I know what Vallejo is. I spent 18 months building a case that kept getting shut down from above, and 6 months ago I finally understood why it kept getting shut down. If the evidence is what you say it is, I don't care where it came from. Tell me where to receive it, and tell me the girl is safe." He typed back. "She's safe. I'll send the files through this channel within the hour. The original chip follows through a courier route I'll specify. Be aware, there is a federal motion being posed at 4 p.m. today that will attempt to recategorize this evidence as a syndicate asset under negotiation. If that motion completes, the evidence may be offered directly to the people it implicates. You need to move before that. Send." He looked at the time. 2:27 p.m. 93 minutes until 4 p.m. He called Cho. "The file transfer," he said. "Reuse channel. I need it going to Mercer's secure address right now." "I need 30 minutes to package it properly so it arrives intact," Cho said. "You have 20, and die 1. He paused. "The 2 men we lost at the port, Kim Sung-min and Oh Jae-hyun." A beat. "Yes, their families. Whatever the standard provision is, double it, and make sure it's processed before 4 p.m., before anyone can freeze syndicate accounts." Cho was quiet for a moment. Min-jae could hear him breathing. "You're not coming back from this," Cho said. "Not as an accusation, as a statement of arithmetic." "Not the way I went in," Min-jae said. Another beat. "The files will be with Mercer in 20 minutes, Cho said. Min-jae hung up. His phone rang 4 minutes later. Not a message, a call. The number was Lee Byung-chul's. He answered it. "Min-jae." Lee's voice was the voice of a man in his 60s who had spent 40 years being the second most important person in every room and had learned to make that sound like wisdom, measured, almost warm. The voice of a man who wanted you to believe the conversation was going to be reasonable right up until the moment it wasn't. "I think we should talk before 4 o'clock. "We're talking," Min-jae said. "I mean in person." "No." A pause. "You've heard things," Lee said. "Yes. People say things when they're trying to position themselves. Things get distorted." "Lee," Min-jae's voice was very flat. "Kim Sung-min and Oh Jae-hyun." Silence. "Say their names," Min-jae said. "Min-jae." "Say their names." The silence stretched. When Lee spoke again, the warmth was gone. What was underneath it was not exactly cold, It was the particular temperature of a man who had done the calculation and was now simply on the other side of it. "What's done is done," Lee said. "The accommodation protected the syndicate. 2 men against the stability of everything we've built. That's not a difficult calculation." "You made that calculation without the council," Min-jae said, "without me. Because you would have made the wrong choice," Lee said. "Because you have always confused personal sentiment with strategic thinking. A journalist and his child are not the syndicate's problem. A federal task force with leverage over our port operations is the syndicate's problem. I solved the problem." "You handed 2 of our people to federal operators running a trafficking network," Min-jae said. "You call that solving. I call it survival." Lee's voice was steady, completely steady. "The chip, Min-jae. Whatever is on it, whatever you've been doing since last night, it ends now. Give the chip to Sung-ho. Tell him to bring it to me. The girl goes back to the people who are looking for her, and we return to the accommodation, and this entire situation becomes something that didn't happen." Min-jae looked at Zuri. She was on the couch with the blanket, listening. She'd been listening the whole time. She was 7 years old, and she was listening to a man argue for her being handed back to the people who had killed her father. And her face was doing what it did. The controlled stillness, the chin held level, the dark eyes taking it all in and processing it, and not breaking. She met his eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "No," Min-jae said into the phone. "Then you're finished," Lee said. "The vote passes at 4. By 5, your authority is suspended. By 6, every asset, every account, every resource the syndicate has built is under council authority. You'll have nothing." "Then I'll have nothing," Min-jae said. A pause. When Lee spoke again, the voice had changed a final time, shed the last pretense of the reasonable man, arrived at something simpler and more final. "There are people who will come to that house," Lee said. "I don't know exactly which house, but they'll find it. And when they do, the only question is whether you make this simple or whether you make it difficult." "Tell them to come," Min-jae said. "I'll be here." He hung up. He looked at Sung-ho. Sung-ho was already moving, checking the door, checking the window facing the driveway, his hand at his side where the weapon was. Min-jae looked at Zuri. "Come with me," he said. He took her to the back room, the smaller of the two, a bedroom with a low window that faced the persimmon slope. He opened the window. Cold air, the smell of dry hillside, the pale afternoon light. "If something happens," he said, "you go out this window and you go up the slope. Not down, up. There's a fire road at the top, runs east. You follow it east until you find a house, and you call 911 and you say your name and you say there's a federal prosecutor named Danielle Mercer who needs to know you're safe. Can you say that back to me?" She said it back to him. Exactly, the name, the instruction, the direction, word for word. "Good," he said. "Are they coming?" she said. "Maybe. I don't know how fast." He crouched down to her eye level. His knees ached. He'd been on his feet for 31 hours. Everything ached. There was a particular quality to the exhaustion of this kind of extended operation that he'd felt before. It came through the bones rather than the muscles, a deep vibration of the kind that no amount of sleep fully fixed. He ignored it. "But I need to know you know what to do." She looked at him. This close, eye to eye. She looked older than 7 and very much exactly 7 simultaneously. The determined set of her jaw and the slight tremble she was controlling at the corner of her mouth, and the darkness in her eyes that was not fear, but was something fear-adjacent, something closer to the specific courage of someone who understands the situation and is choosing not to let it win. "Min-jae," she said. "Yes." "You're not going to let them take me." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "Okay." She sat down on the floor beneath the window with her back against the wall and the backpack in her lap. "Ready." He looked at her for one more second and then stood up and went back to the front room. Sung-ho was at the window. "Vehicle," he said. Low, quiet. "Access road, 2 minutes out." Min-jae checked the time. 2:58 p.m. They'd found the property in 47 minutes. He thought about how. Ran it in 4 seconds. The only people who knew he was connected to Choi Won-suk's property were Cho Dae-won, who he trusted, whose entire morning had been spent building the case against Lee. and anyone who had access to Min Jae's personal trust documentation, which was a private filing, not syndicate record. Personal trust documentation. Filed with an estate attorney 12 years ago, through a law firm that also handled, on the corporate side, certain Baeko structural documents. Lee Byung-chul had been on the council for 12 years. He had access to the law firm. He'd probably had access to this address for years and had simply never needed to use it before. Min Jae let the last of the illusions go. "How many?" he said to Sung-ho. "One vehicle visible, probably two. One coming from the east on the fire road." Sung-ho's voice was completely even. It was the voice of a man who had been in these situations before and had survived them through a combination of competence and the particular absence of panic that comes from having accepted a long time ago that these situations would keep arriving. 4, maybe 6 people total. Min Jae nodded. He reached into his jacket, took out the small metal case containing the chip, looked at it for a second, the size of a matchbox, the weight of nothing, the thing Malcolm Carter had hidden in his daughter's hair and died for. He typed a single message to Mercer. "The original chip is in a case at 4417 Ridgecrest Road, Simi Valley. Owner's name on file, Choi Min Jae, personal trust. If I'm not reachable by 6 p.m., send federal retrieval to that address. The girl's name is Zuri Carter. She knows your name." He sent it. He put the case back against his sternum. He looked at Sung-ho. Sung-ho looked back. "Ready?" Min Jae said. "Been ready," Sung-ho said. The vehicle on the access road had stopped. Through the window, Min Jae could see the nose of it just visible past the tree line. Dark, heavy, the kind of vehicle that carried multiple people and was chosen for that reason rather than for comfort or speed. The driver had cut the engine. No doors opening yet. Waiting. Setting up on the far side simultaneously, which meant the fire road vehicle was positioning. Running a 2-point approach. Coming from east and west, which meant they'd mapped the property, which meant they had more than 47 minutes on this, which meant Lee had started moving on this address before the 4 p.m. motion, before the phone call, possibly before this morning. Lee had known about this property for 12 years and had been sitting on it. Min Jae felt something cold move through him. Not fear, something more clarifying. The specific sensation of understanding the depth of a game you'd been in without knowing it. The front door of the dark vehicle opened. A man got out. Civilian clothes, federal posture, the same controlled, deliberate movement he'd seen outside Henyo last night in the rain. Then another door. Then another. 3 from that vehicle, moving in spread formation toward the house, and through the back window Min Jae could already see movement on the slope. Shapes coming down through the persimmon trees, 2 of them, coming fast. 5 total. Moving on a house with 2 defenders and a child in the back room. Min Jae breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The front man stopped 20 feet from the porch and raised his voice. "Mr. Kang, my name is Ethan Graves. I'm the operations director for the Federal Task Force, currently seeking return of material taken from a 7-year-old minor last night. I'm asking you to step outside and let's have a—" "I know who you are," Min Jae said through the door. His voice carried. "I know what the task force is. I know what you moved through those containers. And I know that right now there's a federal prosecutor who has 14 months of your documentation and is deciding what to do with it." Silence from outside. "So what happens next," Min Jae continued, "is up to you. You can come through that door and we'll find out how this goes. Or you can get back in your vehicle and understand that whatever window you had closed about 40 minutes ago when those files landed." Another silence. Longer. Then Graves spoke again and his voice had changed. The professional negotiator tone gone, something more direct underneath it. The voice of a man deciding whether to believe a bluff or whether to treat it as a fact. "The prosecutor has nothing without the original chip," he said. "Files can be fabricated. Chains of custody matter, you know that." "The chip's already spoken for," Min Jae said. "By who?" "By someone you can't reach in the next 4 hours." "Mr. Kang." Another shift. Something harder now. The last layer of professional courtesy coming off. "The girl. She's 7 years old. Whatever her father found, whatever you think you're protecting, she doesn't need to be in the middle of this. Let her come out and this ends cleanly." Min Jae looked at Sung-ho. Sung-ho was watching the slope through the back window, tracking the 2 coming down through the trees. He held up 2 fingers, then made a motion, spreading them. They'd separated, coming at the back from 2 angles. Min-jae looked at the front door, looked at the hallway leading to the back room where Zuri sat under the window with her backpack. He thought about how this was going to go. He'd run operations. He knew how this geometry worked. 2 points of entry, 5 trained operators, one of whom was a federal agent, which meant the legal and physical cover was complete. He and Sung-ho could hold the front. The back was the problem. He had one move and it was going to cost him something he couldn't get back. He reached into his jacket and took out the metal case and looked at it one more time. Then he walked down the hallway and knocked on the back room door. Zuri opened it immediately. She'd been standing at the door. He held the case out to her. She looked at it. "The chip," he said. "Put it in your backpack, the inside pocket, all the way to the bottom, under everything else." She took it. Her small hands were steady. She unzipped the backpack without fumbling and put the case exactly where he'd said and zipped it back. "There are men coming," he said. "2 of them, up the slope. When I tell you, you go out that window, you go up, you find the fire road, you go east. You don't stop. You don't wait. You don't look back for me." She looked at him. Her chin was level. Her eyes were steady and very dark and full of something that was not a 7-year-old's thing to carry, but that she was carrying without being broken by it. "What about you?" she said. "I'll be right behind you," he said. She looked at him for a long second. She knew he wasn't sure about that. He could see it in her face. She was 7.5, and she'd been reading the room accurately since the moment she walked into a Korean restaurant in the rain and chose the right man by instinct. And she was reading him now just as accurately as she'd read everything else. "Okay," she said, and the word did everything it had been doing all day, containing more than it said, holding more than it should have to hold for someone her age, choosing forward because there was no other direction left. Outside on the slope, a branch cracked. Min-jae turned. "Now," he said, and Zuri Carter went out the window into the cold November air, her backpack on her back, the chip inside it, her father's photograph inside that, running up the dry slope through the bare persimmon trees toward a fire road she'd never seen before, trusting the direction he'd given her the way she'd trusted everything he'd told her since the moment she whispered 4 words to a stranger in a rainstorm, and he said, eat, and he meant, "I'll take care of the monsters," and she had believed him. He was going to make that true, or he was going to die making it true. And right now, standing in the back room of his dead uncle's house with the window open and the cold air coming in, and 2 federal operators moving through the persimmon trees on the slope outside, those were the only 2 options available, and he was done pretending otherwise. He turned from the window and walked back down the hallway. Sung-ho was at the front door. He looked at Min-jae once, a look that contained a question and an answer and an acceptance of both simultaneously. And Min-jae nodded, and Sung-ho exhaled through his nose and turned back to the door. "Graves," Min-jae said through the wood. Outside, a pause. "I'm here. The 2 men you sent up the slope. Call them back." A longer pause. "Mr. Kang, there's a child on that slope," Min-jae said. "She's running. If your men catch her, this ends one way. If you call them back and we talk, it ends another way. Those are the options." Silence. Min-jae listened. Through the back window, he could hear footsteps on the dry hillside, the crunch of dead grass and loose shale, moving fast and then slowing. Slowing. He couldn't tell if Graves had signaled them or if they'd lost the sound of her. Then a voice from outside, not Graves, a radio call close to the house. Words he couldn't fully make out. Then Graves again. "She's not on the slope," Graves said. "She made the road." Min-jae breathed. 1 breath. Complete. The first clean breath he'd taken in 31 hours. "Then there's no point in this," he said. He reached for the door handle. "I'm coming out." "Min-jae." Sung-ho's voice was low. "Stay inside," Min-jae said. "If I go down, you call Han Dong-min and you tell him everything. He has enough to work with." "That's not—" "Sung-ho." He looked at him. 9 years. The man had driven him in silence through more nights than he could count, and had never once asked for an explanation or a justification, and had simply been there in the particular way that some people are there, completely, without performance. "Thank you," he said. Sung-ho looked at him, nodded once, jaw tight. Min-jae opened the door. The late afternoon light hit him flat and pale. The sun low over the western hills. The valley below the property spread out in the long amber light of 3:30 p.m. in November. The kind of light that makes everything look both very beautiful and very final. Ethan Graves was standing on the gravel path that led to the porch. 45 or so, lean, the kind of fit that came from consistent military maintenance rather than vanity. His face was the face of a man who had done this work long enough that the work had settled into his features and stayed there. A flatness around the eyes, a set to the jaw that was not cruelty exactly, but was the structural result of having looked at certain things for certain lengths of time. Two men flanked him at distance. The two from the slope were coming down around the side of the house, rejoining the formation. 5 total, as Sung-ho had counted. Graves looked at Min-jae. "The chip," he said. "The chip is gone," Min-jae said. "The girl has it." "The girl is gone. So yes." Graves' jaw moved. Something passed through his eyes, a calculation running, adjusting, the tactical mind processing the new information and its implications. His hand was at his side, not on a weapon, but near enough. "What did you send Mercer?" he said. "Everything." "Files can be—" "I know what you're going to say. Files can be challenged. Chain of custody. I know the argument." Min-jae looked at him steadily. "But the argument takes time. And while your attorneys are making it, there's a federal grand jury looking at 14 months of shipping manifests with your operational signatures on them. There's an audio file. There's a video." He paused. Malcolm Carter was very thorough. Graves' expression didn't change. It didn't need to. The flatness around his eyes deepened by a degree that was almost imperceptible and entirely visible. "Where does this end?" Graves said. "For you? I don't know yet. That's Mercer's problem." Min-jae looked at him. "For the network, tonight, the port operations, the containers, the children you've been moving, that ends tonight." "You think one prosecutor and a dead journalist's files—" "I think," Min-jae said, "that you came to this house with 5 people instead of 50, which means you don't have authorization for 50, which means someone above you doesn't know you're here, which means Hargrove sent you off the books because the official response to this would require explaining what the task force actually does, and that explanation goes places Hargrove can't afford to go." He let that sit for a second. "You're alone, Graves, same as me, except I made peace with that this morning, and you're still pretending you have options." The 2 men from the slope had reached the flanking positions. 5 people, spread across a 20-foot arc in front of the house. The geometry was what it was. Graves took a step forward. Min-jae didn't move. "The chip surfaces," Graves said quietly, "and it names names. Those names have reach. That reach extends to things you care about, your organization, your people. The infrastructure you've spent 15 years—" "I know," Min-jae said. Graves stopped. "I know what it costs," Min-jae said. "I've been calculating it since last night. I'm done calculating." He looked at Graves with the specific flatness of a man who has made a decision that is past the point of being a decision and has become simply a fact. Do what you came here to do or get in your vehicle. Those are your options. Something shifted in Graves' face. The calculation completed. Whatever it landed on, it landed hard and fast, and Min-jae saw it coming in the half-second before it happened. The slight shift of weight, the hand moving from beside the weapon to on it, and he moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that looks the way it looks in a film. Smooth and choreographed and without consequence. It was ugly and loud, and it cost. He took the first man's forearm across his shoulder and felt something pull in his neck that was going to be a problem for a week. He put the second man down with his elbow and felt the impact travel up through his shoulder into his back. The third man caught him across the ribs with something that was not a fist, and he felt the breath leave him entirely and spent 2 seconds that felt considerably longer in the specific hell of not being able to inhale. Sung-ho came through the door. Later, Min-jae would not be able to reconstruct the exact sequence with precision. What he knew was that Sung-ho had made a decision that was not the decision Min-jae had told him to make, and had made it without hesitation, and had been very effective. 2 of the 5 were down. Two were running the risk-benefit of continuing the engagement against two opponents in a confined space and arriving at conclusions that slowed their decision-making. Graves had a weapon out. Min-jae was on one knee on the gravel, breathing in the specific way of a person with at least one rib that was either broken or very badly bruised. Each inhale a managed negotiation with his own body. He looked up at Graves. Graves looked down at him. "The chip's gone," Min-jae said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Mercer has the files. You shoot me, and none of that changes. The only thing that changes is the charges against you." Graves' hand was steady. His eyes were not. "How does this end?" Min-jae said again. "For you. Personally. Not the operation, you. Because the operation is already done. I need you to understand that. It was done when Zuri walked into that restaurant. It was done when Malcolm Carter spent 14 months building a record you didn't know existed. It was already done." He looked at Graves. "How this ends for you is whether you're the man who shot an unarmed person on a gravel driveway in Simi Valley, or whether you're the man who picked up the phone." Silence. The two remaining standing operatives had gone very still. Graves's weapon arm lowered by 2 degrees, then 5, then it was pointing at the gravel. He stood there for a long moment with the weapon at his side and his face doing something that was very far from simple. Then he put the weapon in his jacket. He took out his phone. He looked at Min-jae one more time, a look that contained things Min-jae was not going to try to name, because some things in a man's face at a moment like that belong only to him. And then he looked at the phone and he made a call. Min-jae didn't hear who he called. He was busy getting to his feet, which took longer than he would have preferred and required Sung-ho's hand at his elbow. And once he was upright, he stood and breathed and let the rib situation present itself clearly and confirmed that it was bad but survivable and filed that information away. He looked at the western hills. The sun was almost down. The light had gone from amber to the deep copper rose of last light, and the valley below was beginning to show its evening geometry. The grids of streets, the scattered glow of early lights coming on, the flat shimmer of the distant reservoir. Somewhere on a fire road to the east of that hillside, a 7-year-old girl was walking toward a house she didn't know yet. His phone rang. He answered it. "She's here," Mercer's voice, controlled, professional, with something underneath it that she was also controlling. She walked out of the hills and knocked on a farmhouse door and asked to use their phone. She called 911 and said your name and mine. A brief pause. "She's safe. She has the chip." Min-jae closed his eyes for 2 seconds. "Okay," he said. "Are you all right?" He thought about what all right meant in this context. "No," he said, "but I'm standing." "I need you to come in," Mercer said, "voluntarily, tonight. If you come in tonight and you come in clean, it changes the legal landscape significantly. If I have to come get you—" "I know," he said. "I'll come in." He paused. "I need 1 hour first." A beat. "1 hour," she said. "Then I need you at the Federal Building on Spring Street. I'll be there." He hung up. He looked at Graves. Graves was still on the phone, talking in a low monotone, his back half turned. The two standing operatives were not looking at Min-jae, which was its own kind of answer about where things stood. The two on the ground were sitting up now, which meant nothing was permanently broken, which was about as good as this situation was going to get. "Sung-ho," Min-jae said. Sung-ho came to stand beside him. "Drive me somewhere first," Min-jae said. Sung-ho looked at him, looked at his ribs. "Hospital. After." Min-jae. "After," he said. "One stop, then I'll go." Sung-ho held the look for a moment. Then he walked to the car. They drove back down into the city in the last of the evening light. Min-jae in the passenger seat with one hand pressed flat against his ribs, not because it helped, but because it gave the pain somewhere to report to. The drive was quiet. Sung-ho drove the way he always drove, smooth, attentive, no wasted motion. And Min-jae watched the hills give way to valley floor, give way to the first suburban density of the San Fernando Valley. And he thought about nothing in particular and everything in general, which was what happened when a person reached the far side of something enormous and hadn't yet found the language for what they were looking at. The stop he needed was in Koreatown, Western Avenue, the same block, Henyo. It was 6:43 p.m. when they pulled up. The restaurant was open, Wednesday evening, the tail end of the dinner service. Through the window, he could see Mrs. O moving between tables with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had been doing the same thing for 30 years and expected to do it for 30 more. He got out of the car. He went inside. The restaurant smelled exactly as it had the night before: doenjang and mackerel and pine floor cleaner. The soft overhead light. The 14 tables. The particular warmth of a small room that has had people eating and talking in it all evening. Mrs. O saw him. She saw the way he was moving, the careful management of the ribs, the neck, the general posture of a man who had been in a physical altercation in the last 3 hours and not entirely won it. She said nothing. She went to the kitchen and came back with a clean towel filled with ice and put it on the counter beside him without comment. He sat on a stool at the counter and held the ice against his ribs and looked at the third booth from the back. He'd sat there for 11 years, barley tea going cold, trying to think without anyone waiting for an answer, running from the ghosts he'd accumulated in the course of building something powerful out of materials that left marks. He'd been sitting there last night at 11 p.m. and the door had opened. He thought about the geometry of it, the specific accident of it. A different booth, and she wouldn't have seen him first. A different restaurant, and she'd have gone somewhere else. A different city, a different year, a different version of himself who'd been harder in the places he was still, despite everything, not entirely hard. And he'd have looked at a wet child in a rain slicker and calculated the exposure and made a different choice. The accident of it was terrifying. The nearness of the version of events in which none of this happened. He was glad he wasn't that version. Mrs. O put a cup of barley tea on the counter beside him. Hot. He looked at it. The table last night, he said. The 200. I charged you for what you ordered, she said. Bowl of soup you didn't eat and a cup of tea. Mrs. O. $22, she said. Don't be dramatic. He looked at her. She was 67 and had known him since he was 29 and had the particular quality of people who have witnessed enough of a person's life to be unimpressed by most of it. Thank you, he said. For last night. She looked at him for a moment. The child, she said. She's safe? Yes. Mrs. O nodded. She refilled his tea without asking. She went back to her tables. He sat with the tea and the ice and the ribs and the quiet of the restaurant for 20 minutes. Then he took out his phone and made one more call. Danielle Mercer answered on the second ring. I'm coming in, he said. 10 minutes. I'll be at the door, she said. He looked at the third booth from the back one more time. Then he put money on the counter, stood up carefully, and walked out. The federal building on Spring Street was lit up against the dark sky. Its windows, the particular institutional yellow-white of a building that runs 24 hours regardless of what's happening outside it. Sung-ho pulled to the curb and stopped and kept the engine running. Min-jae sat for a moment. You don't have to wait, he said. I know, Sung-ho said. Min-jae looked at him. Sung-ho was looking straight ahead, hands on the wheel, the way he looked when he was driving, except the car wasn't moving. Go home, Sung-ho, Min-jae said. Sung-ho was quiet for a moment. What happens to you now? I don't know yet. Mercer says voluntary cooperation changes things. There's no guarantee of what it changes them to. He paused. The syndicate is the council's problem, Sung-ho said. Not mine. A beat. I worked for you, not for the council. Min-jae nodded. He opened the car door. The cold night air came in. He stood up onto the sidewalk, the ribs sharp and immediate when he straightened, and he looked at the building. Sung-ho, he said through the open door. Yes. You're a good man. I should have told you that before tonight. He closed the door. He walked into the building. Mercer was at the security desk inside, 41, medium height, with dark hair cut practically, and the kind of stillness in her face that came from years of rooms where the stakes were high, and composure was the only tool that worked in all of them. She looked at him for a moment as he came through the door, taking in the damage with professional matter-of-factness. You need a hospital, she said. After, he said. After, she agreed. She looked at him. The chip is in evidence. The files are in evidence. The grand jury convenes tomorrow morning. She paused. Hargrove was taken into federal custody 40 minutes ago. his deputy and 3 of his operational staff within the last hour. Port Authority arrests are proceeding as we speak. She kept her voice level, factual, the way people deliver enormous things when they're trying not to let the enormity derail the conversation. It's moving. And Graves, he said. Graves called his federal supervisor, his actual supervisor, not Hargrove's chain, from a driveway in Simi Valley at approximately 3:40 p.m. He's been talking since then. Her mouth moved slightly. Apparently someone on a gravel driveway convinced him that his options were narrower than he'd been working with. Min-jae said nothing. And Lee Byung-chul, Mercer said. His counsel motion passed at 4 p.m. as anticipated. By 4:30, he was trying to contact Hargrove's office to negotiate the chip's return. She looked at him steadily. He's going to be indicted separately, accessory to federal criminal enterprise. Min-jae absorbed this. The syndicate. 15 years of construction, the architecture of it, the legitimate businesses and the illegitimate ones, and the careful balance between them. All of it now in the hands of a council that had just passed a motion stripping his authority, half of whom were about to face their own legal exposure, the whole structure vibrating with the impact of what the last 20 hours had done to it. He let it go, not easily, not without the specific gravity of understanding what it meant to let it go. But he let it go the way you let go of something when your hands are needed for something else, and you finally accept that you cannot hold both. The girl, he said. Mercer's expression changed. Something shifted in it. Not softness exactly, something more considered than that. The face of a person connecting to something that mattered beyond the case. She's with a family care coordinator right now. She asked about you. She paused. She said to tell you the elephants remember. Min-jae stood very still. Elephants, Zuri had said, sitting across from him in a restaurant booth in the rain, with her feet not reaching the floor, and her braids dripping, and her dark eyes taking everything in. Because they remember everything. He put one hand flat against his sternum, against the place where the metal case had been, now empty, now in evidence, the thing Malcolm Carter had hidden in his daughter's hair and died for. I want to see her, he said. I know, Mercer said. There's a process. She's a minor. There's going to be a guardian appointment, a placement review, She stopped. Read his face. It's not tonight. I'm sorry. He nodded. He understood process. He'd spent 15 years working around it and inside it, and occasionally building his own version of it. He understood that it moved at its own pace for its own reasons, and that the reasons were not always wrong. Okay, he said. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. For what it's worth, she said, what you did, I'm not in the business of characterizing the person who did it. That's not my job. But the outcome. She stopped, started again. Malcolm Carter spent 14 months on this. He built something that should have been built by people with badges and resources and institutional authority, and those people were the problem instead of the solution. And he did it anyway, and he died for it. She held his gaze. You're the reason it didn't die with him. Min-jae said nothing for a moment. He died for his daughter, he said finally. Not for the case. The case was what he had to do. She was why he did it. He paused. Keep that distinction when you talk about him, in whatever comes next. Who he was, why he did it, keep that clear. Mercer held his gaze. I will, she said. She meant it. He could tell. Not because he trusted easily follow. He didn't, had never been able to afford to. But because he'd spent a lifetime reading the difference between what people said and what they intended, and what she intended was sitting right at the surface of her face, uncomplicated, real. All right, he said, let's do this. 10 years passed. The way they do, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of days that don't feel like anything individually and turn out to have been everything in aggregate. The way a scar doesn't form in an hour, but in months of slow, unglamorous biology that results eventually in something permanent. The trial was the largest federal corruption prosecution in 2 decades. It ran for 14 months. It implicated 31 individuals across 4 states. It produced convictions in 27 of those cases. Victor Hargrove received 43 years. Ethan Graves, who had made that call from a gravel driveway and kept talking for 11 months, received a reduced sentence of 12 years in exchange for complete cooperation. Lee Byung-chul received 18 years. The network, the containers, the manifests, the shell organizations. The children moved through cargo channels while the task force charged with finding them ran the operation. Was dismantled piece by piece, the evidence presented in the precise, meticulous language of a dead journalist's 14 months of work. Malcolm Carter was awarded the Pulitzer Prize posthumously. The citation described his work as an act of singular moral courage. The actual object, the certificate, the medal, was accepted on his behalf by a woman who had not yet been born when the work began, but who had grown up knowing every page of it the way some children know bedtime stories. Min Jae served 31 months in a federal facility in Southern California. The voluntary cooperation, the civilian involvement, the nature of the assistance provided. Mercer had been right that it changed things. It did not make things easy. Nothing about the 31 months was easy. But he had understood, walking into that building on Spring Street, that easy was not the currency available to him and had not been for some time. He was released on a Tuesday in March. The facility's exit was a door that opened onto a parking lot, and the parking lot was ordinary, except cracked asphalt, a chain-link fence, the flat California sky overhead the color of faded denim. There was no one waiting. He'd asked for that specifically. He walked to the bus stop at the end of the block and rode the bus into the city and got off in Koreatown and walked the rest of the way. He was 51. His neck still bothered him sometimes. The rib had healed correctly. The syndicate had not survived intact. What remained of the Baeko organization after the indictments and the council's collapse and the 18 months of federal investigation that followed had reorganized under different leadership into something smaller and more cautious, and it operated without his involvement and without his name. He did not miss it in the way he'd expected to. He missed certain people. He missed Cho Dae-won, who had served his own brief sentence and retired afterward to Jeju Island, and sent Min Jae a letter once that was 3 lines long and said nothing directly and meant everything. He missed Sung Ho, who had driven him to a federal building and gone home, and was now, as far as Min Jae knew, driving for a legitimate car service in Pasadena and doing fine. He got a job, not the kind that made use of what he'd built, something simpler. He worked for a wholesale Korean grocery distributor, logistics coordination, driving and route management. It paid less in a month than he'd spent on lunches in his previous life. He found, to his own moderate surprise, that this did not ruin him. The work was concrete. The outcomes were visible. Boxes moved from one place to another and either arrived or they didn't. And if they didn't, you found out why and fixed it. He was, in the most boring sense possible, at peace with it. He thought about Zuri. He'd thought about her continuously across the 31 months and the years after. Not obsessively, not in the consuming way that suggests a person is trying to hold on to something, but consistently, the way you think about a thing that matters. He'd received one letter, through Mercer, about 2 years into her placement with a family in the Bay Area. The letter was written in a child's handwriting that was already becoming less childlike around the edges. It said, "I started a book about my dad. I'm going to finish it someday. I got a gold star in reading. I still like elephants best." Z. He'd kept the letter. It was in the inside pocket of his jacket at all times, the paper worn soft at the folds. The day the trial ended, the last day, the final verdicts, the word guilty read 27 times in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles. Min Jae was in Koreatown. He'd watched the coverage on his phone sitting in the park on Normandy, and when the last verdict was read, he put the phone in his pocket and sat for a moment with the November light coming through the trees and the sound of the city around him doing what it always did. He went to Haenyeo. He sat in the third booth from the back. He ordered barley tea and let it go cold the way he always did. He didn't bring his phone. He sat with no obligations and no agenda, and no one waiting for an answer from him. And he thought about a Wednesday night 11 years ago when a wet child in a red rain slicker had walked through that door and chosen him the way you choose the thing that seems strong enough to hold, and had been right, more or less, with the caveat that strong enough to hold and unbreakable were not the same thing, and she had somehow known the difference at 7 years old. He thought about Malcolm Carter laughing at something just before a shutter closed in a warm kitchen he'd never seen. He thought about a note written in a child's careful letters at the bottom of a man's last message. "Please help my dad." He hadn't been able to do that. He'd been able to do something else. He hoped it was enough. He had reason to believe it was. He was trying to make peace with the gap between what you attempt and what is possible, which was the work of a lifetime and not something that resolved cleanly. His phone buzzed. He almost didn't look at it. Then he did. A message from a number he didn't have stored. Untraceable format, but not the threatening kind. The routing structure was different, cleaner, the kind a federal prosecutor's office might use for personal communications they wanted kept separate from official channels. The message was 4 words and a punctuation mark. Guilty. All counts. DM. He held the phone for a moment. Then another message. Same number, different sender signature. I told you he'd stop them. Z. Min-jae looked at the message for a long time. Outside on Western Avenue, the city moved through its ordinary Wednesday evening. The delivery scooters, the neon bleeding color across the wet pavement because it had started raining again without him noticing. The ordinary human traffic of people going places they needed to go. The restaurant smelled of doenjang and mackerel and pine floor cleaner. Mrs. O was doing something behind the counter, the soft sounds of end of day, the flat clatter of metal bowls being stacked. He was 51 years old and alone in a booth with a cup of cold tea and a message from a 27-year-old federal prosecutor who had been, once, a 7-year-old girl standing on her toes in a rainstorm, whispering a request that changed everything. He typed back. He did. MJ. He sent it. He put the phone face down on the table. He looked at the door. He thought about what it cost and what it came to, and whether those two things balanced out. He did not arrive at a clean answer. He didn't think there was one. He thought there was just this, the continuation, the morning after the war, the ordinary Tuesday of existence that follows the extraordinary Wednesday of everything that matters. The city outside and the tea gone cold, and the knowledge that a child who had needed something from him had grown into someone who needed nothing from him now, except the knowledge that he was still there. He was still there. That was enough. Outside, the rain came down on the neon streets of Koreatown. The red, the blue, the gold, the colors bleeding together across the wet asphalt into something that didn't have a name but that you recognized if you'd ever stood in the rain and needed someone to say yes without explanation, yes without conditions, yes because the alternative was not something you were willing to become. The door stayed closed. The tea stayed cold. Kang Min-jae sat in the third booth from the back and breathed in the quiet of the only room in his life where no one was waiting for an answer, and for once in 30 years he had nothing to figure out, nothing to survive, nothing to calculate or protect or dismantle or carry. Just this. Just here. Just enough.